Good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for the numbers to keep climbing. We've got over 900 people this morning, so that's going to take a little bit of getting everybody in the room. So just bear with us while we do that, and then we'll start the show this morning. Okay, we're just going to give one more minute. The numbers are still steadily climbing, and then we'll get going. Okay, I think we're good to go. Welcome, everybody, to the third of the deep dives in this series that Paz is hosting with MHCLG. And today we're going to be covering some big topics, climate change, flood risk, and the natural environment. So if we move along, we've got Anna behind the scenes who is moving the slides along for us. So hello, as I said, well, at the moment, there's not quite 900, but we're over 500 at the moment, and more people may join. We're actually doing this in a town hall mode. So that means that your cameras and microphones and the chat function is switched off. I'm sure many of you have been in these sort of webinars before. It just makes it much easier to manage as an event. But don't worry, we have got a Slido, so you will be able to interact through the Slido. And hopefully a lot of you have seen the link and submitted questions already. What we're encouraging you to do is to upvote questions. So there's lots of multiplications already. So what we'd like you to do is vote those questions, and it's more likely to get asked in the Q&A session. We're actually going to have two Q&A sessions. After the first couple of presentations, and then another one after the second two presentations. And we'll remind you when we get to that point as well. Of course, with so many people interacting, we're not going to have a chance to answer all the questions. But all the comments and the questions will go to MHCLG to have a look at, and we'll do our best to answer the top ones and the popular ones. So please do pop your questions in. And we're going to leave the Slido open for a week until this time next Friday, or until the end of next Friday. So next slide, please, Anna. So I'm joined this morning. Well, first of all, I'm Rachel Murter. I'm one of the principal consultants at PAS. I specialise in the natural environment, so that's why I've been roped in to host this meeting this morning. But joining me, we have got Annabelle Cooper, and she's going to be covering the climate change and clean energy. We've also got Heidi Maybury. She's doing the managing flood risk and coastal change. We've got Carlton Rose, and he's covering conserving and enhancing the natural environment, and Alexander, who's doing pollution, public protection, and security. So lots to cover, lots of speakers. We've also got some additional contributors as well. Shireen Ansari, Greg Foster, Maddie Bauer and David Roberts. And they're there to address any questions that come up in other topic areas that the other guys presenting and supporting them. So if we have the next slide, please, Anna. This is our agenda. We're covering a lot today in the 2 hours. We've got an overview to follow after this introduction, and then we're on to the climate change, then the flood risk. We'll have a break for the Slidos and the Q&A for those two topics. Then we're proposing having a very short comfort break It's a long time, isn't it, to engage with lots and lots of information and lots of technical things and thinking about questions. So just a bit of a brain break as well in the middle of our session today. And then after that short break, we're going to move on to the natural environment and the pollution, public protection and security. And then following that, we'll have questions about that and then wrap up next step. So fairly simple. We'll move on to the next slide, Anna. Just to remind you, all the way through, please use our Slido. Here we go. If you haven't already opened the link, that's a QR code and some joining information there. And again, just a reminder to upvote existing questions if you can, so that we are we'll can see what the most popular, the most pressing issues are. So next slide, please, Anna. Here we go. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, our colleague in MHCLG, Christina, who is going to give us an overview. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really looking forward to talking to you about our policies, which we've been working on for a long time. So it's really great to share them with you, to hear the questions that you've got and hear some feedback. So just to introduce myself, I'm Christina Davey. I'm Head of Planning Policy at MHCLG, and my team, which are all here on the call today, cover the range of different chapters in the NPPF that we're going to be covering. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so before we dive right into the specific policy areas, we thought that it would be helpful just to provide a bit of context to the consultation as a whole, to set the scene for the presentations this morning. So first of all, why are we changing the NPPF? Now, as you will know, the framework has been changed a number of times since its introduction in 2012, with the most recent revision in December 2024. And it's important to stress that the changes that were made at that time in 2024 were very much reflected the early priorities of the new government as it was then. This government wasn't the first to say that it thought the NPPF could be expressed more clearly. You may well know that under the previous government, there was a lot of debate about how we could reform the NPPF to make it more rules-based. And there were the proposals taken forward through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act to create national development management policies. And much of the thinking that was undertaken then has informed the proposals that have now been published. So there are a number of really important objectives that underpin what we are now consulting on. So firstly, we think that the NPPF could be expressed more clearly and more in terms of the policies that you would get in development plans, so that it's more accessible and understandable. There is a desire that successive governments have had to try to make national policy more precise, more rules-based, so that it's more consistent and more predictable in its application. We are also trying to make policy more comprehensive. The NPPF at present doesn't cover all of the different aspects of decision making in particular. So there are some particular gaps that we're trying to fill, partly with particularly with the aim of avoiding duplication of those matters in plans where they cover common development management issues. And then lastly, we're trying to take the opportunity to do more to support growth. I'm sure you'll all be aware that growth has very much been a central mission of this government, and many of the changes made in December 2024 had that in mind. But those changes did not cover all aspects of the framework, whereas this consultation is one where we're looking at all aspects of development that the NPPF covers, and also thinking afresh about whether they are as supportive of growth as possible, while of course at the same time maintaining environmental protections. Next slide, please. So those objectives translate into a number of principles which underpin what we're proposing to do. So firstly, to highlight, we're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. Our ministers were very keen that we weren't tearing up well understood and well established aspects of national planning policy. So what we've tried to do in this consultation is maintain many of the core aspects of national policy which people are familiar with, whilst adapting them to this new approach, i.e. better presentation, making policies more rules-based and filling gaps, etc. Secondly, a key objective is to distinguish those aspects of the framework which are about development management to those which are about plan making. And currently, as I'm sure you know, the framework often talks simultaneously about planning policies and decisions doing certain things. That approach was partly driven by minimising the length of the document by referring to both elements at once. But we recognise that that approach doesn't necessarily result in the clearest presentation of the policies, particularly that you could use in a development management context. So we wanted to separate out those two things. As I've said, some elements of the consultation are about updating and filling gaps, but at the same time, we're not trying to cover absolutely everything. The government very much recognises that some aspects of planning policy need to be set out at a local level as they are genuinely local issues. So we are trying to focus on big picture issues that apply across the country or most parts of the country. And then finally, it's important that we recognise the legal changes through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, and now also the Planning and Infrastructure Act. So those acts taken together create a new framework for producing different types of plans, importantly spatial development strategies, but also other elements of the development plan. So these proposals that we're consulting on align with how they would work. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this context, there are a number of really big changes that we're proposing as part of the consultation. First, there is this split in the way that policies are set out between decision-making and plan-making policies. We have, however, kept policies within the topic-based chapters, which reflects the way in which the NPPF is currently presented. We could have done this differently. So, for example, we could have grouped all of the plan-making policies and then all of the decision-making policies, but we considered that on balance, it would be better to retain the topic based chapters with the plan making and decision making policies clearly distinguished within each of those. And we felt that this flowed better and was easier to see all of the things relating to particular topics in one place. But having said that, we are very much asking about the overall presentation of the document in the consultation. So we would welcome views on that point. You'll see that we've reordered the chapters, and also we've pulled some things out into specific chapters where they're not in specific chapters already, particularly to give a stronger emphasis to climate change policy, to energy and water, and to public protection issues and flood risk. So many of the chapters that we're going to be diving into in more detail shortly. There is a simpler presumption in favour of sustainable development proposed in the new NPPF. This is very much part of the approach that we are proposing to development inside and outside of settlements. And this is an area where we are setting out new national policy. So until now, the NPPF hasn't really got into the principle of developments in particular types of location in any comprehensive manner other than in the green belt. So we are for the first time trying to set out some key locational principles focused around whether development is inside or outside of settlements. And then finally, we have annexed some additional material that you'll currently find in planning practice guidance, where we felt that this material was essential for the operation of the NPPF itself. This includes material on the standard method for housing need, for grey belt identification and additional flood risk tables. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to improving the presentation. So improving the presentation of the NPPF has been really important for us as well. And I've spoken about the split between plan making and development management policies, but there are other various things that we have done as well. So the introduction to the NPPF has been revised to set out more fully how we intend the policies to be used. And then as now you will find procedural policies on both plan making and decision making. These have both been substantially revised, particularly the plan making policies to reflect the new plan making framework. We've also set out a brief objective for each chapter at the beginning of each chapter. So these objectives are not intended to be policies that you would apply in a development management scenario, for example. They are there for explanation as to what the set of policies in each chapter is attempting to do at a high level. We have moved away from consecutive paragraph numbering, so that each policy has its own number and its own numbering system within it. That's with a view to avoid everything having to be renumbered if anything were to change in the future. And we know that it can be a nuisance whenever we change the NPPF and all the paragraph numbers shuffle around. So this new approach will avoid that and also hopefully make it easier, especially in a development management context, to refer to particular bits of the framework. You'll see that footnotes in the framework currently do run consecutively, but we are planning to address that in the final version. So when the policies are a bit more stable, we'll integrate as many of those into the main text or use an alternative numbering system, so that, again, you don't get this same degree of issue with consecutive numbering of the footnotes. We're also going to consider how the final version, how we can make the online version of that as digitally accessible as possible, in terms of how you navigate the document. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so finally, before we move on to the detailed policy topics that we're going to cover today, I thought it would be helpful to summarise at a high level what some of those policies actually do, starting with those procedural policies on plan making and decision making. So as already highlighted, the plan making policies are very much focused around the new plan making system, and many of the policies are tailored to specific types of plan, so that it's much clearer what you should do if you're working on a particular type of plan. So, for example, you'll see a set of policies for how a particular set of plans should be examined, which is over and above what is set out in the legislation. We're also very clear in these policies about non-duplication of policies that would be in the new NPPF. We want plans to focus on locally specific issues such as site allocations, designations, associated policy requirements, and any locally specific policy matters which go beyond that. And also aligned to that, with that, a new policy on the scope of quantitative standards to be set in plans. On the decision-making front, there's a heavier focus than currently in terms of proportionality of pre-applications, and also on information requirements. And we're also attempting to set out more consistently the information required associated with development proposals. There is also an important policy, policy DM3, which is all about the overall approach to handling planning applications, which consolidates some of the messages you'll see in the current framework about making decisions positively, add some additional strands to that as well. And we've also said quite a bit more about viability and how we can expect viability to be treated, and the limited circumstances in which we think viability needs to be assessed in terms of a site-specific matters at the decision-making stage. We have also sought to clarify the relationship between planning decisions and other regulatory regimes, which is we recognise is a big issue in many parts of the country, drawing very much on the established case law position, and obviously here that other regulatory regimes which, as current planning policy says, says do need to assume will operate, but equally that if there are material considerations that relate to matters governed by other regimes, they do need to be taken into account. Okay, that is the end of the overview section of the presentation. I am now going to hand over to Annabelle, who is going to run us through the climate change and energy and water policies.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to start my section of the presentation by discussing the climate change chapter. As I'm sure you're all aware, climate change presents an urgent and far-reaching challenge with implications for communities, ecosystems, and the economy. And we understand that the planning system has a vital role in reducing emissions, building resilience, and to the changes that climate change will bring. To recognise this, the revised framework now includes a dedicated climate change chapter. The climate change chapter brings together policies on both mitigation and adaptation. The objectives of this chapter and the policies within it are to support the transition to net zero by 2050 and to shape places which are more resilient to the effects of climate change. Given the cross-cutting nature of the climate change issues, we've adopted a signposting approach, signposting to relevant parts of the framework, such as design and sustainable transport, to support a more holistic approach. And importantly, the chapter has been brought forward in the framework so that climate considerations are embedded early and clearly. Overall, the policies set out a more comprehensively how development plans and decisions can make a positive contribution to tackling climate change. Next slide, please. I'm going to discuss the plan making policy. So the new plan making policy consolidates and redrafts existing sections of the NPPF to provide a clearer and more cohesive set of principles for preparing development plans, requiring development plans to take a proactive approach to both mitigating and adapting to climate change. The policy sets out expectations, for example, how spatial strategies and allocations can contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which can be informed by baseline carbon assessments. Also, development plans should also seek to address climate risks in their allocations and to ensure that these are now anticipated and considered over the lifetime of the development. The policy also includes a list of climate risks as previously. While these risks are illustrative rather than exhaustive, we've now included reference to wildfires to reflect that increasing likelihood with climate change. Next slide, please. There are now two new decision-making policies. These are replacing paragraph 163 of the current framework. This is to provide and establish a clearer and more comprehensive approach to addressing climate mitigation and adaptation. They again adopt a signposting approach by cross-referencing relevant policies elsewhere in the framework. The climate change mitigation policy sets out key considerations for decision-making. These include promoting sustainable transport and development patterns, encouraging design approaches that conserve energy and other resources, opportunities to reuse existing structures and materials, protecting and restoring habitats that are important carbon stores, as well as restricting fossil fuel extraction. In addition, the policy now gives substantial weight to the benefits of improving energy efficiency of existing buildings and substantial weight to proposals that intend to draw from heat networks or renewable and low carbon energy sources. Similarly, the climate change adaptation policy replaces 163 of the framework and goes further by requiring that adaptation to be considered both in current and future climate impacts over the lifetime of developments. As with the mitigation policy, it sets out clear expectations and considerations for decision making. These include flood risk, coastal change, floods, overheating, and wildfires. It's considered that the climate change policies go significantly beyond the existing framework to provide a clearer and more comprehensive approach to supporting the transition to net zero and shaping places that are more resilient to the effects of climate change. Next slide, please. The revised framework now also introduces a new chapter, which is titled Securing Clean Energy and Water, recognising the increasing importance of resilient energy and water infrastructure. This chapter brings together existing policies on renewable and low carbon energy with two new policies. One that addresses planning for energy and water infrastructure, and two, decision making for water infrastructure. The new plan-making policy that's been introduced is to take account of the capacity of the existing energy and water infrastructure and its future requirements. It establishes the need for early engagement between plan-making authorities, utility providers, regulators, and network operators, and expects plans to make appropriate provision for new or upgraded infrastructure. The second plan-making policy in the chapter is an update of the existing paragraph 165 of the current framework. However, it now explicitly refers to electricity network infrastructure. This recognises that such infrastructure is often delivered as a standalone component of the energy system and is not only connected with renewable and low carbon projects. This policy is now also strengthens the requirements for development plans to identify suitable areas for renewable and low carbon energy and electricity network infrastructure. Next slide, please. The policy has two decision-making policies. The first one on renewable and low carbon energy development and electricity network infrastructure consolidates the current framework, paragraphs 168 and 169. It goes further than the existing policies by giving substantial weight to the benefits of energy security, economic development, and net zero. Also, giving substantial weight to repowering at life extensions of existing sites and the contribution that small-scale and community-led projects can have. The policy also clarifies expectations for decommissioning and site restoration, recognising that most schemes are permitted on a temporary basis. Alongside this, we've introduced a new water infrastructure policy, which supports the delivery of water supply, drainage, and wastewater infrastructure where it is not already covered by permitted development rights or does not fall within the NSIT regime. This policy gives substantial weight to proposals that would increase capacity to support planned growth, strengthen security of supply for existing users, improve water quality, and reduce waterborne pollution. Therefore, the objective of the policies in this new chapter is to support the development and operation of the energy and water infrastructure in ways that aligns with wider development and growth, Clean Power 2030, and Net Zero 2050 objectives. Thank you. I'll now be handing over to my colleague, Heidi.
Thanks, Annabelle. So I am going to now just be going over the policies proposed in the chapter on managing flood risk and coastal change, which is chapter 18. So as Christina outlined in the introductory slides, we are proposing a new dedicated chapter on these topics in our consultation, partly because it's such a pressing issue, but also because it's quite a technical area and it involves several assessments, and we just want to ensure that our policies can be laid out as clearly as possible. So the objective set out at the beginning of the chapter maintains the overarching aim of existing policy, which is to minimise risks to development arising from all sources of flooding and coastal change, taking into account the impacts of climate change, and doing so by steering development away from areas of risk and ensuring that development will be safe for its lifetime without increasing flood risk elsewhere. But we also felt that it was important to make specific reference to SUDs in the objective. SUDs are mainly covered in policy F8 in the decision-making section, but we just wanted to highlight their growing importance in preventing flooding as well as their other wider benefits. So within our plan-making policies, we should probably just start by highlighting that overall, the expectation remains for plans to take a sequential and risk-based approach to locating development. But more specifically on assessing flood risk, we've clarified the importance of considering flood risk for both now and in the future, given the impacts of climate change. And to help strengthen coastal protection, we've also added some new requirements for local authorities when they are designating coastal change management areas, including that they must take account of the relevant shoreline management plans and the National Coastal Erosion Risk Map. They must extend designation to include estuaries and tidal rivers, and they must consider risk over the next century. Next slide, please. Thank you. So moving on to the decision-making policies, I think the most important thing to note here is that we have made very clear that development at risk of flooding, whether that be at present or in the future, should be refused unless it will be made safe for its lifetime without increasing flood risk elsewhere. But more specifically, with assessing flood risk, we've set out the areas found to be at risk on the flood risk map for planning will require site-specific flood risk assessments to be carried out on them. And then we've also clarified some elements of the sequential test. So we've set out when the sequential test isn't required, and that includes instances where a site is potentially at risk of just surface water flooding specifically, but it can be evidenced through a site-specific flood risk assessment that that surface water flood risk can be mitigated through the site's proposed layout or design or other mitigation measures to ensure that the development would still be safe for its lifetime. We've also set out where the sequential test should be carried out. So the area to which the test should be applied should take into consideration the anticipated catchment of the development in terms of its likely users and occupiers. And then whilst the overall principle of the sequential test has stayed the same, with us maintaining that development should be steered to areas with lower flood risks, we have, however, omitted reference to development not being permitted, because in some cases it might actually be appropriate for development to proceed when it's weighed against other material considerations, and as long as all the other tests in the chapter are satisfied, including that development would be safe for its lifetime. And then in relation to the exception test, we've clarified how the test operates in the context of what development types are regarded as incompatible with river or sea flooding. And we've done so by referring directly to tables that are now in Annex F. And then we've also set out when the exception test doesn't need to be applied. And that includes instances where development has been proposed on an allocated site that was already subject to the exception test at the plan making stage, unless flood risk has increased significantly or a more vulnerable use has been proposed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So still in the decision-making section, for SUDs, we've retained the need for development proposals of any size that have drainage impacts to incorporate SUDs, but we have added that these should be designed in accordance with the new national standards. We've included those in a footnote, and this is to just help ensure that SUDs are of a good quality and are more consistent across the board. We've also added a policy that links to SUDs about avoiding the enclosure of watercourses and encouraging river channels to be deculverted and renaturalised, which can provide further water management in the same way that SUDs do. And then it is also worth noting that in Annex C, which contains information requirements for planning applications, and it links to the decision-making chapter in the framework, we've added a new requirement for SUDS information to be provided as part of planning applications. So in regard to coastal change management areas, to strengthen coastal protection a bit further, we've added a new requirement for any areas found to be at risk on the National Coastal Erosion Risk Map to be subject to all the same tests that coastal change management areas are subject to. And then we've also bolstered the wording to just clarify that permanent new residential development is not appropriate, even through change of use. And then finally, we've included some additional development types in the flood risk vulnerability classification table, which is one of the tables now in Annex F. And we've done that basically just to provide greater certainty for developers and local authorities as to what information and tests are required to support various different types of proposals. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour.
I'm back. So here we are. Hope you had a good break bit of a stretch. We're going to pass over now to the second half of our series with the natural environment, and we're going to invite our colleague to Carlton, who's going to cover this section for us. So I'm going to bob off and Carlton's going to bob on.
Thank you, Rachel. In this section of the presentation, I'll be explaining the natural environment policy. The first comment to make is that the existing chapter 15 has undergone significant redrafting to incorporate new legal requirements, such as the Environment Act and the Planning and Infrastructure Act, and to ensure that our policy is well aligned with current working approaches with regards to nature. It's also important to note that policies on ground conditions and pollution, which were originally part of Chapter 15 in the current NPPF, have been moved to a separate chapter titled Pollution, Public Protection and Security, which my colleague Alex will explain in a little more detail following this section on the natural environment. Very much in keeping with the overall NPPF aims set out at the beginning of this presentation, the objective for the chapter on conserving and enhancing the natural environment is to have a clearer and more rules-based policies on the environment, addressing policy gaps that we identified and also reducing ambiguity. Next slide, please. So as mentioned on the previous slide, the new policy seeks to reflect the importance of key environmental evidence. One of the ways in which it does this is by making reference to local nature recovery strategies. Now, local nature recovery strategies, as many of you will know, will enable decision makers to safeguard the areas of most importance for biodiversity and target the best opportunities for nature recovery that the government wished to bring about. This policy sets out the importance of local nature recovery strategies in directing development away from sensitive locations and identifying the best opportunities to integrate development with environmental restoration. Another change that we see to the policy drafting is a much stronger focus on green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. We felt that this would be beneficial to encourage a stronger emphasis on green infrastructure and nature-based solutions through the framework, as we know that well-designed green infrastructure can bring about many benefits to wildlife, to climate mitigation and adaptation, human well-being, and also the economy. Natural England publishes the Green Infrastructure Framework, which supports the greening of towns and cities, as well as connections with surrounding landscape. In the new plan making section, we're encouraging, excuse me, in the new plan making section, we're encouraging the setting out of standards for green infrastructure provision, which should also draw upon Natural England's green infrastructure standards for England, which are found alongside or in the framework, green infrastructure framework. For decision making, there is further reference to green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, which emphasises the use of interventions which can deliver places which are nature-friendly, healthy and climate resilient. Another change includes a new emphasis on conserving and enhancing existing features of environmental value, such as chalk streams, with the new wording stating that the development plans identify features which require particular consideration in managing development. Next slide, please. The proposed natural environment chapter includes a clearer, more comprehensive expectations for how development proposals should contribute positively to the natural environment. And this includes consideration of the environmental qualities of land proposed for development, including recognising the importance of landscape character and retaining policy on agricultural land, which is also found in the current NPPF. It states that areas of poorer quality agricultural land should be used in preference to that of higher quality. So we've retained that. Biodiversity net gain plays an important contribution to nature recovery, and our proposed policy provides some further clarification on its application to give applicants and authorities more certainty and to bring about a greater level of consistency across local planning authorities. Also in this chapter, we see continued support for features for species in development, which also includes a new requirement for integrated nest boxes, which are currently commonly known as Swift bricks, to be incorporated into development wherever possible. Finally, for this slide, we have also included a distinct policy on trees in new development. And this includes existing policy on trees, which is currently in the design chapter. We felt that the trees policy sat better within the natural environment chapter, and we wanted just to ensure alignment with the wider environmental objectives. Next slide, please. The new chapter also continues to safeguard protected landscapes and references the need to avoid harm to their statutory purposes and special qualities. And the intention here is to ensure that by complying with the new policy, that decision makers are able to demonstrate that they have complied with the Protected Landscapes Duty brought in through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. This requires relevant authorities to seek to further the statutory purposes of protected landscapes. In addition, we have added reference to protected landscape management plans, which set out further detail on the particular special qualities of these much loved areas. We also kept the exceptional circumstances test for major development, but have added more detail on how we expect adverse impacts to be mitigated, compensated. Policy N6, there's a more systematic policy on the hierarchy of protected areas, which includes anticipation of the introduction of environmental delivery plans through the Nature Restoration Fund. There's explicit policy on locally designated sites, such as local nature reserves, wildlife sites and geological sites. And we felt that there was a gap in the framework here with regards to these areas, and we sought to close that gap with this new policy wording. The policy also continues to set out high safeguards for irreplaceable habitats. Overall, we've tried to be clearer about the hierarchy of protected sites, and we expect that this will complement the local nature recovery strategies, which are already mapping out these protected areas well. Finally, we have consolidated policies on maintaining the character of the coast with those on heritage coasts, cross-referencing to policies on coastal change and flood risk. That concludes this section on the natural environment. I believe I'm passing over to my colleague Alex, who will talk about the pollution chapter.
Thank you, Carlton. I'm now going to talk through the newly formed pollution, public protection and security chapter 17 of the updated NPPF. So the reason why we've created this chapter is to pull together policies around key constraints on new development in a coherent way. In order to do this, we've drawn out policies from current natural environment and healthier communities chapters. The objective of this chapter is to ensure that any risks associated with development are identified early in the planning process, including risks posed by pollution and other hazards, ensuring that developments are appropriate and safe and do not compromise existing uses. Prioritising the safeguarding of key areas of land, making sure provision is made for development required for public safety and security. We want to make sure any impacts from development upon new and existing sites are taken into account. Take, for instance, we've had feedback on the agent of change policy, but it's not been implemented as effectively as it should be, and we're looking to address this. The policy now includes details of the types of matters that should be considered, focusing on early discussions with existing users to identify potential impacts, and the need to consider current and permitted levels of activity to reduce the risk of conflict. It's important to note that all this is set within a context of government's objective of building 1.5 million homes this Parliament. Next slide, please. On this slide, we focus on three main things. Firstly, from a plan side of things, we're ensuring that plans contribute towards compliance and are linked to national targets for pollution. This should ensure special plan policies linked to national targets. Secondly, we're retaining NPPF policy 196 on ground conditions, but we're seeking views through the consultation on any additional tools or guidance needed to make better for decision making on contaminated land. And thirdly, we're looking to create a more rules-based approach on pollution, where the policies are intended to work with broader considerations and more specific thresholds related to different categories of pollution linked to development. For example, water quality is based on existing guidance, and the new reference to PM 2.5, but as a legally binding target derived from the Environment Act 2021. Next slide, please. We want development proposals to anticipate potential security risks at the application stage of the process. To do this, we're building on existing paragraph 102 of the current NPPF, through seeking to address possible malicious threats and other hazards, for ensuring public safety is taken into consideration through mitigating potential impacts are designed out. We're also introducing new policy concerning safeguarding areas and hazardous sites, technical sites, these are for military use, and nuclear sites. The focus is on emerging preparedness and the aim of reducing risk to human health and promoting public safety. The aim is to strike a balance between the right level of consultation with relevant bodies, but ensuring that new developments are safe, optimising a balanced approach using appropriate mitigation without compromising on the operation of these existing sites. Compared to the existing NPPF, we're increasing the level of support for sites that have the purpose of securing national defence and increasing public security. I'm now going to pass back to Christina, who will conclude the presentation.
Thank you, Alex. Can we just go to the next slide? Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, I know we'll be moving on to the Q&A on these topics shortly, but just to wrap up in terms of the logistics for the consultation. So the consultation is open for 12 weeks and will close on Tuesday the 10th of March. So still a fair few weeks to look at the documents in more detail and prepare your responses. We are really keen to hear from as many of you as possible. We appreciate that this is a really significant redraft of the framework with some substantial new policies as well. So we look forward to receiving your comments. There's a link there to the consultation document, but you should be able to find it easily online. And
here we go, we're up to the wrap-up session, so we're finishing a little bit earlier, but as I said before, keep your questions coming. The closing date for the actual consultation, as Christina said earlier on, is Tuesday the 10th of March. Please respond through the link on the MHCLG website. We've got that there. Just to flag as well that this is part of an event series that we've been hosting, with one including the NPPF for councillors, that's online. We've also got some in-person road shows. The next one is in York. Maybe some of you on this call may be joining us in York next week. And we've had these deep dive sessions as well. So they're going to be uploaded and posted on the PAS website as and when we get to them. So they'll be going up soon. Just another plug as well for our networks as well. It's really, really important with all these changes going on that we keep communication going between ourselves. So we've got a number of different networks, including the local plan networks, the development management leaders network, all sorts of networks. They're available through the PAS website on our Keep in Touch page. You can also sign up to our newsletter. I'm going to plug the Nature Network as well. That's a new one, a relatively new one. So please join that. That will cover a lot of these subjects that we're talking about today. So next section, please. Next slide, please, Anna. And yes, don't forget, I'm sure you've all been doing this because we've had been inundated with some fantastic questions. Lots keep on coming, the polls and interactions. And I think that must bring us to the close. That's probably the final slide, is it, Anna? That is the final slide. Yes, so it just remains for me to say thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to all our amazing presenters for their information that they shared and for the questions that they fielded. Thank you to you too for engaging so actively on the Slido, for showing up today. As again, these presentations are going to be on our website. We're going to give you back some time this morning. Thank you again, and we're going to close the event. See you again soon. Thanks very much, everybody.